This is Shaping Opinion, a production of O'Brien Communications. Jay, you have an interesting way to get people to talk about you. It's what you describe as your own talk trigger. Can you tell us what that is?
Sure. The idea of a talk trigger is essentially doing word of mouth on purpose, Tim. So many companies sort of take word of mouth for granted. They assume that if you just run a competent business that people will talk about you, but that's not really how human beings behave. You got to give them a story to tell, something that they don't see coming, that they're like, oh, that's different. So what I do, I spend a lot of my time giving presentations as a keynote speaker. So the way it works is that when I am booked to give a presentation, about a week or so before I show up, the meeting planner is given an email that has a link to a website that I built called dressjbaer.com. And if you go to dressjbaer.com, you are presented the option to pick out which suit I'm going to wear on stage at the event, because I am known for my crazy plaid suits. And so if you go to dressjbaer.com, I think there's 11 now that you can choose from, 11 different suits, and you can pick your color or your pattern or what have you. And then it actually goes on my calendar, so I know what suit to pack when I go on the road for this event, and meeting planners love it, and they tell their friends about it.
And what's the reaction? You said meeting planners love it, but what's the typical reaction?
What's funny is a lot of times I don't get a lot of reaction when they do it, but I get the reaction when I show up. So they say, oh, that suit's even more interesting than I thought when I picked it. And then several times in the last few months since I rolled this out, whomever introduces me incorporates that talk trigger into the introduction. So they'll say, well, here's Jay Baer from Convince and Convert, and he wrote this book and these other books. And by the way, he's got this crazy suit, which was picked out by the meeting planner, Jennifer. Great job, Jennifer. And so it all gets tied together for the audience, which is terrific as well.
I'm Tim O'Brien. In this episode of the Shaping Opinion podcast, we're joined by Jay Baer. He's a popular speaker, an inductee into the Word of Mouth Marketing Hall of Fame, and the author of several books, one of them being Talk Triggers, the complete guide to creating customers with word of mouth. The premise of our podcast is simple. We talk about people, events, and things that have shaped the way we think. Today we're going to talk with Jay about the power of word of mouth to sell products or services, increase awareness, educate the public, and create a brand. It's a term you may hear every day, word of mouth. I've been in the PR business for decades, and I've seen quite often how something was spread through word of mouth, but rarely was word of mouth treated as its own media channel. Today we're going to talk with Jay Baer about the dynamics behind word-of-mouth publicity, hear some stories of some organizations doing it right, and just how to harness it for yourself. All right. Jay, before we talk about word-of-mouth marketing, I wanted to learn more about you and what attracted you to the field of word-of-mouth marketing, and in the process, your own career journey. Can you tell us what led you to word-of-mouth marketing?
I started off in politics, and so when I was a young professional, I ran political campaigns, which is an industry that is driven a lot by word of mouth. I didn't think much of it at the time. I went from politics to what we would now consider to be traditional marketing and public relations. And from there, at a very young age, I got involved in digital, back when digital really didn't exist, in 1993. And I've been involved primarily in digital marketing ever since. But I started to work on the book Talk Triggers and more word of mouth strategy for my clients, my consulting firm Convince and Convert, because they kept saying to me and my strategy team, like, we feel like we've got a decent handle on the mechanics of social media or the mechanics of content marketing, but we're not really sure like what we should be saying. And then we had all these questions about influencers as well. And I thought, geez, these companies, some of which are, some of the most iconic brands in the world, they just don't really understand what story they're trying to tell. And it really shook me up. And I realized that, despite the fact that word of mouth is the best way to grow any business, most companies don't really have a plan for it. They just kind of like hope that it happens. And so started to scratch that itch a little bit and ended up with a word of mouth strategy system that we use for clients at Convince and Convert, and then the book Talk Triggers. And it's something that I have a real passion for. And I I think it's a great time to almost revisit the concept of word of mouth, Tim, because so much of what we're talking about in business today is about customer experience. And a word of mouth strategy is just a customer experience that's designed to create conversations.
It's funny you mentioned that people don't have a plan for that, because before this episode, and just out of curiosity, I looked in the dictionary to see what the dictionary said about word of mouth. And Webster described it as oral, often inadvertent publicity. They included that word inadvertent. Mm-hmm. It's almost by design or definition, isn't it, that word of mouth is unplanned?
I think it's unplanned on the part of the storyteller, right? The customer. It absolutely can and should be planned on the part of the company, and that's what we're trying to do with the work that we execute for our clients in my company and the book as well, and my new podcast, the Talk Triggers show. We're trying to say, look, you can do word of mouth on purpose. It doesn't have to be an accident.
Well, in a few minutes, we'll talk about what works, what doesn't work, and the dynamics of word-of-mouth marketing. But I thought a good starting point would be simply to talk about one company. I actually heard you discuss it on your own podcast called Talk Triggers, and I also read about it in your book called Talk Triggers. Can you tell us about that debt collections firm and what it did that was so different to get people talking?
Yeah, it's thanks, Tim. It's one of my favorite stories, actually. That I sort of uncovered while doing the research for the book with my good friend Daniel Lemon, who's my co-author. There are 5 different ways to create a word of mouth strategy, 5 different types of talk triggers. And these are 5 different things that you can architect in your customer experience so that customers notice you and talk about you, so you can be, disproportionately fast, et cetera. But one of the ways that you can become talkable, if you will, is through disproportionate empathy, where you treat customers with kindness and compassion and warmth and humanity beyond what they expect or anticipate. And what's funny about that one, Tim, is it's the only one that we talk about in the book and in our consulting firm that really we wouldn't have mentioned maybe, 2-3 years ago, because there was a point in time, you're old enough to remember, as am I, probably some listeners too, when treating customers with kindness and compassion and warmth and humanity wasn't really worth talking about. It was just how we did things, right? It was just business, it was life. But I think it's safe to say that we are currently living in an era of empathy deficit, where treating people with that kind of compassion is no longer a default state. Certainly in business and life, definitely in politics, empathy is not the leading the pack anymore. And that kind of makes me a little sad as a human being, frankly. But as a business strategist, it's one of the greatest opportunities we're ever going to have. Because today, when you do treat people with kindness and empathy and warmth and respect and compassion, it stands out and becomes talkable. It can actually propel your business forward. And a company that is perhaps epitomizes that idea is a company called AmeriCollect. And they're based outside of Green Bay, Wisconsin, Manitowoc County. And they are, as you mentioned, a collections firm. Now, they're a specific kind of collections firm, though. They do medical collections. So their deal is they collect debts on behalf of hospital systems and physicians groups. And if you know anything at all about the collections business, the typical playbook is that you call, and then you call and 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 call until you just sort of grind somebody down and they finally pay their overdue bill. It is not an industry known for its compassion. In fact, quite the opposite. And generally speaking, and I'm not overstating this at all, generally stating in the industry, the rule of thumb is that the meaner and sort of scarier and more intimidating you can be, the more you'll collect, because you're saying, look, if somebody owes you a debt, they probably owe several debts, right? They probably owe money to the phone company, and they probably owe money to the water bill and whatever, and they owe money to the hospital. Well, if you can be the more frightening collector, they're going to pay you first, because they figure, well, you're really going to get them in some trouble, right? That's literally how this business operates. You scare people and you grind them down until they pay you. Well, that doesn't sound like a great amount of fun. And Kenlin Gretz, who's the owner of AmeriCollect, he started there as a collector some 20 years ago. And he's like, this kind of sucks and maybe there's a better way. So he decided to change the entire system for how this particular company, this one company, they're the only ones that do it like this in the whole country, as far as I know, how this company collects debts. And so their philosophy, and it's right in their slogan of their company, it's written all over their walls, is ridiculously nice collections. Ridiculously nice collections, not scary and intimidating. And so quite literally, I've sat in on phone calls with them. They treat the people that they are collecting from like family, better than family. They kill them with kindness. And not only is that much more psychologically satisfying for all involved, it works wonders. So there's this thing I learned about in the medical collections business, which I had no idea till I did the research, that apparently it's quite common that companies, hospitals, physician groups, when they're looking to hire a collections firm, what they do is they call it a shootout. And so, Tim, they take like half of the debt and then they give it to company A, and they take the other half and they give it to company B, and they say, okay, you've got, 60 days or something to collect as much as you can. And at the end of those 60 days, whomever has collected the most gets all of the debt going forward. They win the shootout and they become the vendor for this hospital or physicians group. Well, since Kenlin and his team moved to the ridiculously nice collections thesis, they have been victorious in 1,997 out of 2,000 shootouts. So they're almost undefeated mathematically, which is pretty remarkable in and of itself. But the thing that really gets me, the part that about this story that I will remember for the rest of my career, I had the great fortune to go to their offices and do a presentation to the people of AmeriCollect about word of mouth and talkable empathy. It was a real honor. What I found out is they've got about 250 employees now. And I asked Kenlin, I said, you guys are pretty rural. I mean, there's not a lot of population centers around here. Like, how do you keep getting all these team members, especially people who want to do collections for a living? And he said, here's the thing, Jay. 60% of their team members are people that they originally called to collect on. Now, I want you to think about that. Imagine getting a call from a collections agency and another call and working with a collections agency and them having so much empathy that you think to yourself, you know what? Once I pay down this bill, I want to go work for that company. Like it's hard to even get your arms around, right? You're like, wow.
These are people who owed money and they were treated so nicely they wanted to work for the company.
Yeah, and do 60% of their team, right? So 60% of 250 people, it's like 150 employees out of 250 were people that they originally collected from. It's incredible.
Well, one of the things I liked about the way you described this dynamic, it was the philosophy that Kenlin seemed to have when he changed his strategy. Mm-hmm. His feeling, you said, was just because they are not paying their bills today doesn't mean they won't pay their bills tomorrow.
That's right.
And if we call them 1, 2, 3, 4 months later and they finally take our calls because we were so nice to them the first time, I thought that was a pretty good long view, don't you?
Oh, absolutely. It's such a smart way to run that kind of business, right? That they're not your adversary, right? It takes two people to get the bill paid. You've got to encourage them to pay it, and they have to actually pay it. And if you're the one who's threatening and cajoling all the time, people just stop taking your calls, which is the challenge faced by everybody else in the industry, which is why they keep calling, and now they're emailing and texting and chasing you down and everything else. So yeah, I think Kenlin definitely has a better mousetrap. And to the thesis of the book, though, it works really well the same way my suit thing works, because their customers, hospitals, physician groups in the area who hire AmeriCollect, tell all the other hospitals and physician groups in the area, like, wow, these are the guys you want to use for collections because A, most importantly to them, frankly, they collect more money. And B, the people that they're collecting from aren't actually mad at the hospital for using these like super rough and tumble tactics to get paid.
And you know this company pretty well, and you also know some other companies. And I thought we're talking about word of mouth, but we're also talking about your technique that you've come up with. It's a simplification of how word of mouth can work, and that is talk triggers. But you had mentioned in your book, The Cheesecake Factory, you said that there was some research, and I thought this was so interesting because if people don't believe this story or that story, they will believe numbers. And when they look at the research that found that a single word of mouth conversation by a new customer leads to almost $200 in an increase in sales for the Cheesecake Factory. And Cheesecake Factory, you said, it generates word of mouth referrals mainly because of its huge menu. So in your book, that's a talk trigger, the huge menu. So and you also conducted your own research for the Cheesecake Factory. What did you find?
So Daniel and I did a lot of different research projects for this book. We did, I think, 4 separate projects. And one of the projects was a national survey of Cheesecake Factory patrons. And as you mentioned, Cheesecake Factory's talk trigger is the fact that their menu is enormous. They make all the foods. Their menu is more than 6,000 words long. They make chicken 85 different ways, which is hard to even fathom, 85 different kinds of chicken dishes, but they make them. And if you go on Twitter, or really anywhere, Yelp, TripAdvisor, anywhere that people talk about restaurants, you'll see tons and tons of online word of mouth about the menu. People are just like, can't believe it. It is the worst place to be a waiter, I'll tell you that, because you're like, hey, are you guys ready to order? Like, no, we're definitely not ready, and you should probably go on break and then come back. So it takes a long time to go through it. But we talked to hundreds of customers in this survey, and we found there's a bunch of different ways to cross-cut the data, but the best way to describe it is 34% of their customers have mentioned that menu to somebody else, have actually told a story about that menu to somebody else. Now, the parallel question, of course, is when's the last time you saw an ad for a Cheesecake Factory? Not very often, right? Because they don't have to spend a lot of money on advertising. Their customers are the advertising. The menu is the thing that, and good food and all that, of course, that stands to reason. But the menu is the thing that stands out. It's the one they don't expect. People go to a restaurant and they expect good food. They don't expect a giant menu, right? So that's the thing that becomes part of the story, the lore of that place, if you will. And as a result, they don't have to spend a lot of money on advertising. Like there's a quote from Robert Stevens, who is the founder of Geek Squad. And I love this quote. He says that advertising is a tax paid by the unremarkable. Advertising is a tax paid by the unremarkable. And that's not 100% true. Like there's a time and a place for advertising, but it's pretty true. Some of the most remarkable companies, the ones that have the best talk triggers, the ones that have the best word of mouth, spend the least on advertising because they don't have to. Their customers do it for them.
There are so many businesses that count on referrals. I mean, you think of the old days of professional marketing where you had lawyers and accountants, and they didn't advertise in lawyers' case because they weren't allowed to.
Right.
So they learned to develop word-of-mouth marketing in their own way through their relationships. But you really break it down into a system in your book. But going back to that one data point that I didn't want to let go before we left the Cheesecake Factory, how many people said they would recommend the Cheesecake Factory when asked for restaurant recommendations? I thought that statistic was amazing.
Oh, it's over half, right? It's unbelievable because, look, how many restaurants do you eat at? A ton, right? But how many restaurants do you eat at that you're like, yeah, it was fine. You've got to give people a story to tell. And that's the key to doing word of mouth on purpose instead of what we're all doing is the word of mouth on accident, right? Is actually creating just a little mental thing that you're like, oh, I didn't expect that. I didn't see that coming. So and what's fun about this is this can work for all businesses and all types. It's not just restaurants. It's not just, collections companies. It doesn't really matter. We work with all kinds of companies that to convert to put these kind of principles into practice, and anybody can do it. You just have to want to.
Well, I hate to get into too much data, but there were some other statistics that you mentioned that I thought were very relevant. Engagement Labs in 2017, they came up with some research that said 19% of all consumer purchases in the United States were directly caused by offline or online word-of-mouth activity.
Yep.
And you estimated that was a $10 trillion economic impact. Where did you get that number?
So we figured out the overall, let's see, how do we do it? The overall number of sales in the economy, the gross purchase revenue of all sales, and it was 19% of that, as I recall.
And there was another firm, Blank & Otis and G2 Crowd. They found that the impact of recommendations and referrals in business-to-business scenarios is greater. In other words, if you're a B2B firm, you count on referrals more than other types of marketing.
Sure. I mean, I think that passes the sniff test, right? I mean, anybody who's in B2B, you're always thinking that word of mouth is a big part of the deal, and it is. But what's funny about B2B is that B2B companies are typically less likely to actually have a word of mouth strategy, even though they should do it even more so, because in my experience, this is not an official stat, but it seems as though most B2B companies have taken, a vow of boredom. Like they have to, they have to be really, really boring, and they can't do anything worth, talking about. They just play follow the leader too much. And there's some great B2B case studies in the book, and we wanted to make sure we put those in there because, we don't want people in whatever manufacturing, software, what have you, thinking like, oh no, that only applies to restaurants like Cheesecake Factory. No, it doesn't. You can, and in fact, I think should have a word of mouth strategy regardless of what you sell or to whom.
One final data point, and I think this gets at the core issue of word of mouth. Nielsen found 83% of Americans trust recommendations from friends and family, and 60% trust online reviews. What I found most interesting about that was how the word trust came to the forefront. Word of mouth is about trust. That's the currency. Can you explain what that relationship is between trust and word of mouth?
There's a philosophy, not even a philosophy, there's a truism called Hicks' Law. And Hicks' Law says that there's a bunch of psychological research that created Hicks' Law, created by a man named Hicks, Professor Hicks. And Hicks' Law says that when people are faced with more and more choices, the ability to make a choice gets harder and harder, right? It creates friction in the system psychologically. There's a terrific book about this. It's called The Paradox of Choice. It's based on Hicks' Law. And so it's why when you go to like a grocery store and you go to the cereal aisle and there's like 75 different cereals, and unless you are specifically going for the cereal that you always eat, you're like, I don't even know how to start this process. This is very, very confusing to me. There's too much information here. And in circumstances when we're faced with lots of choices, as we typically are in first world economies in particular, the ability to break through those number of options by relying on the opinions of somebody else who you trust is how we sort of fight against Hicks' Law, right? So that's why so many different reports, not only those in the book, but even those published since the book came out, will demonstrate that word of mouth is, depending on how you ask the question, either the first, second, or third most prominent way that people make decisions for anything, right? Whether they're buying a piece of licorice or a car, it's like, well, I don't want to screw this decision up. So if an actual human being says, yes, this is good licorice, or yes, this is a good car, I'm going to actually rely on that because I don't want to just wing it and make a bad decision.
So trust is a process that we use without thinking about it, but it's our process.
Absolutely. Yeah. We don't always think like, okay, what I'm trying to do is find somebody I trust. The trust is almost inherent. And anytime what's fascinating is that we trust each other more than ever. People trust people more than ever, and we trust businesses and organizations less than ever. And why that's important is that it means that word of mouth as a customer acquisition vehicle is actually more important than it's ever been, right? The more you can get your customers to become volunteer marketers, the better off that your business will be. Some of that advocacy takes place offline, just having conversations on the phone, around the water cooler, at your kid's soccer game, whatever. And then some of those conversations take place in social media, whether it's Twitter or Facebook or a review site like a Yelp or a TripAdvisor or what have you.
You mentioned in your book another measure, and that was the Edelman Trust Barometer. And I'm in the PR business. I'm very familiar with the Edelman PR firm. And that barometer is now something that people throughout the public relations business and in the business community look for now because,
yes.
And you mentioned just a second ago, something that came out of that barometer is that people trust business less than ever. But what I really like, because now we can move from the theoretical to the applicable, and that is your book, that is your system, Talk Triggers, because what you've been able to do is take all these sources of thinking and data points, and you've condensed it down into what people can do with it. And I think that's the most important thing. What can people do with word of mouth? How can they make it their own? And you came up with a 2-word solution, and that's Talk Triggers. You've written an entire book that takes the theory and empirical knowledge about word of mouth and boils it down to these actionable technique. So can you tell us a little bit about what the criteria is for a talk trigger?
Yeah, you bet. Thanks. And you nailed it. I mean, look, there's other books out there on word of mouth. Like the world didn't necessarily need another book about word of mouth, but what my observation was about other word of mouth books, and many of them are outstanding. In fact, we interviewed a lot of those authors for Talk Triggers. The challenge is that most books out there, really all books out there heretofore about word of mouth essentially say, word of mouth is really important and you should get some. Okay. Agreed. We're on the same page. What we didn't have is a system for actually going out and doing that, which is what I think Daniel and I have added to the conversation. So we say, yes, word of mouth is important, more so than ever. Here's why that's true. But then, okay, here's how to actually create a word of mouth strategy that turns your customers into volunteer marketers. And so one of the ways we do that is the book itself is set up in a 4, 5, 6 system. So the 4 requirements of a talk trigger, the 5 types of talk triggers, and then a 6-step process for creating a talk trigger. And the first piece, the 4 piece, is that your talk trigger has to be remarkable, right? That's non-negotiable. It has to be something worthy of remark. It has to be a story worth telling. That's the first piece. It has to be repeatable. And what we mean by that is that all customers have access to it. It's not just like a promotion or a one-shot deal or on your birthday or only for your best customers. It's part of your customer experience all the time. Third thing is your talk trigger should be reasonable. Like it doesn't have to be like we're going to give you, a new car. Like so often in business, we try and awe people into talking about us, like by doing something giant. And the reality is that doesn't usually work. It feels like it would, but it doesn't, because people don't talk about things they distrust, right? They're not going to recommend something that they're like, I'm not sure if this contest is true. So you don't want to make it too big. And the fourth thing your talk trigger must be is relevant. It needs to make sense in the context of who you are and what you do, right? It's not just like, hey, guess what? We rented an elephant and it's in our conference room. It's like, well, that might create conversation, but it doesn't create the right kind of conversation because it's incongruent. So you want to make sure it sort of fits into the overall brand, if you will.
Yeah, and you mentioned the 5 and the 6. Well, the 5 I thought was important too, because the 5 types of talk triggers is where we start to see how it comes to life. You mentioned one earlier, AmeriCollect. It's the best example of empathy.
Yes. Showing
customers you care and doing it in such a way that people talk about it. There's 4 other ones too, useful, generous, speed, and attitude. Mm-hmm. But I thought some of the examples were great. Can you tell me a little bit about the Air New Zealand case?
Oh, sure. Yeah, that's an interesting one. Air New Zealand is an example of talkable usefulness is usually how we characterize that. When a lot of these talk triggers examples can fit into more than one category, and that's by design. But Air New Zealand is an interesting brand. They always do things a little unusually, right? We probably could have called them a talkable attitude because they're pretty funny and irreverent for an airline. But in this particular case, Daniel and I pointed out their talk trigger, which is called the Sky Couch, which is a very intriguingly named thing to begin with. And the way the Sky Couch works is it's a seating option in coach class on long haul international flights, and so it's really cool. They developed this thing, and so you can fold up the armrest, and then some footrests flip down, and then you press another button, and essentially the three seats abreast become like one couch, almost like a futon, I guess, like you would have in college, that kind of thing. So it's really great if you just want a little more room to stretch out, right? So couples get the Sky Couch a lot because then it's like 3 seats worth of space for 2 people. And what it's used for most often is for parents traveling with kids, right? So then the kids, it's almost like a little, romping area for small tykes, and people love it. It looks really weird walking by, like, what is that thing? And it's been a huge, huge hit for them. And it's just really useful. It's just really smart. And again, that's not marketing, right? It's a product. And I think it's an important distinction, Tim, that talk triggers aren't marketing. Like, we say word of mouth marketing all the time, but as Daniel and I think about these things, it's not really marketing, right? It's not a product or a price or a promotion or a coupon or a contest or, whatever. It's something that you do differently. It's part of your experience, right? So the Sky Couch is just one of the things that they offer. It's not like a special offer. It's not like, limited time only, get the Sky Couch. It's just a thing that they do, but it's a thing that they do that creates conversations.
And it creates expectations because, as you said, it has to be sustainable. So every time someone goes to that airline, they can expect to see that Sky Couch.
Yes.
And there are other things, and some of them are less extreme. Actually, some of them are so simple that we take it for granted. When we go to a restaurant and we expect to have a free refill on a drink. But there's one example in your book of a generous talk trigger, and that was a kitchen called Skip's Kitchen.
Yeah.
It's a restaurant. And I thought it was great because they didn't quite go out looking for a talk trigger. It just sort of evolved. They had a playing deck that they used to help identify customers and their bills. They used just a deck of playing cards. But then one day the owner had an idea of how to use those playing cards to be generous with his customers. What can you say about what Skip did with his playing cards and his own sort of spontaneous creation of a talk trigger?
Yeah, Skip is a real inspiration. He was the regional manager for Chili's restaurants in Northern California. And he'd been there for a while, and he decided he wanted to do his own thing, kind of pursue his own entrepreneurial vision. So he quit his job, and he and his wife opened their own restaurant called Skip's Kitchen and said, hey, we're going to make a go of it. And look, the restaurant business is super competitive. And even if you have good food, which they do, they definitely have good food, specialize in hamburgers. But, is there another business even more competitive than that? I mean, every restaurant has a hamburger, and most of them are pretty good. So it's a tough thing. And so, as you said, they were trying to find a way. It's counter service, right? So you walk to the front and place your order. Then they bring their food out when it's ready. And so you were trying to figure out kind of some operational things, nothing too crazy. And they decided to use this deck of cards as a way to kind of keep people intrigued and to create conversation. So now the way it works is you go to Skip's and you order your food, and before you pay, they say, Tim, let's try something. And they pull out a deck of cards from under the counter, and they fan them out face down, and they say, pick a card. I'm like, wait, what? And you pick a card, and if you get a joker, your entire meal is free, whether you've ordered for just yourself or you're there with 10 friends, like whatever the size of your order is, it's totally free. And it's pretty great. On average, about 4 people a day win that game. Mathematically speaking, and when they win, they go crazy, right? They're putting reviews in social media. They're calling their mom crying. It's a pretty fun thing. Everybody celebrates and everybody remembers it. Like if you go to, I have a new show called The Talk Trigger Show where I every Tuesday I have a new episode, and it's a 6-minute video where I tell one of these stories. And it's also a podcast. You can find it at talktriggersshow.com. And I just shot the episode for Skips yesterday. And I've got some great video of them actually playing the card game with a friend of mine who actually lives in Sacramento, where Skips is based, and it's just a really fun story. So about 4 people a day win, and they go crazy. And I looked it up for the purposes of my new episode of my show, and more than, I think it's about, let's see, what was the number on that? 16%, something like that. About 16% of all of the reviews on TripAdvisor specifically mention the card. Like that's a pretty high talkability rate in just one channel where talk could occur. And what's funny about it is even though the sign outside the restaurant is like big giant sign says Skip's Kitchen, pretty unmistakable. In Sacramento, a lot of people don't call it Skip's Kitchen. They call it That Joker Restaurant because it's so tied into what they do. And they've been in business now for, let's see, 8 years, since 2011. And Skip's has spent, startup restaurant in Sacramento, has spent a grand total of $0.00 on advertising ever.
What I like about that example is that it was so simple.
Yeah.
And you don't have to go out and spend money to have logo merchandise. Yeah, it's not a giveaway or anything like that. He used what he had, and it was just an attitude. Oh, and speaking of attitudes, then there was one other type of talk trigger that I wanted to ask you about, and that is the talk trigger that is talkable attitude, as you describe. And you use an example in your book of Uber Conference. But there may be other ones because there are so many companies out there that have a unique attitude that other people talk about.
Yeah.
Can you describe what it is about attitude that makes it a talk trigger?
It's one of the hardest ones to pull off because it has to be part of your DNA, right? So if you're going to be a little left of center, a little kooky, a little wacky, a little unusual, a little different, irreverent is probably the best way to describe it. That has to be true, right? You can't fake that. People will figure that out real quickly if you're just trying to be irreverent once. It's either part of your brand or it's not. But if it is, and you can kind of deploy it consistently, it can be really, really effective. I'll tell you, speaking on my show, today's new episode, which just dropped a few hours ago, is a story about a company that has talkable attitude. It's a company called Moose Jaw. Do you know those guys, Tim?
I've heard of them. Yeah.
Yeah. So they're an outdoor gear retailer, e-commerce, right? So they sell tents and camping equipment and fishing poles and all that kind of jazz. And they're now actually owned by Walmart. Walmart bought them for a bunch of money a couple years ago, but they haven't messed it up or anything. They are super funny, like in every way. That's kind of their talk trigger. So I have it right here on my desktop because I just finished the episode. So I bought something from them recently, and they sent me an email confirmation, right, as companies do e-commerce. So I'm going to read for you the email confirmation I got from the company Moose Jaw. And you tell me whether this is a story you would tell somebody else, because I sure as heck told it. Okay, here's the email confirmation. You're awesome. I got so excited about your order, I texted my mom about it. Your order has been placed. Way to go. This is the best order confirmation we've sent out all day. We recommend either printing this receipt and framing it to hang on your foyer, or at least taking a screenshot and using it as the background of your iPad. It would also be nice for you to forward it around to a couple friends and maybe even an enemy or two. If you're bored, check us out on Instagram, Facebook, or Twitter. Our CFO said he doesn't understand why anyone would use Twitter. He also thinks that a narwhal is a made-up animal. Please don't tell anyone about this.
That's definitely the beginning a talk trigger.
Right. Like, you just don't expect that. Now, what I love about this example is that it doesn't take any more effort to do it that way. You know what I mean? Like, you're writing an email confirmation anyway. You could either write it to be talkable or you could write it to be perfunctory. You have made a choice. And every talk trigger in every business is an operational choice that you make to either be talkable or to not be talkable. It's just about choices.
If someone were to try to figure out a talk trigger for their business or their organization, without going through the whole process, what would be the first thing they could do or should do to start thinking about how to come up with their own talk trigger?
Yeah. And so in the book, we break down that whole process. We also have an online course where we teach people the process. But I'll tell you that the general thinking is this. The worst way to do a talk trigger is the way that everybody wants to do it, unfortunately, which is what everybody wants to do is get in a conference room and brainstorm a great idea. Well, here's the problem. If it was that easy, you'd probably already have one, right? The challenge is that we think that we know what customers want and we think we know what customers expect, but we don't. And so the best way to do this and how we do it in our company and how we teach it in the book is to really interview customers, to get out there and talk to customers and ask them, hey, when we sent you an email confirmation, what did you expect? When you got a menu at our restaurant, what did you expect? When we called you to collect from you, what did you expect? What you're doing is creating a customer expectations map. Because, Tim, once you know what customers expect, you by definition know what they don't expect. And what they don't expect is what the talk trigger has to be. That's where the talk trigger lives. Because if they expect it, they don't talk about it. Like I never tell anybody, oh my God, you won't believe this perfectly adequate experience I just had. Like that's not how people behave, right? I don't tell stories about turning on the light switch and the lights coming on because I expect that to happen. So the customer research is the best place to start to really understand what customers expect. And then you come up with some potential talk triggers and then test one. We're a big believer in testing a talk trigger, seeing if it's talkable. Then if it is, you roll it out to everybody.
Jay Baer, thank you for joining us today.
Absolutely my pleasure. Thanks for the time.
To learn more about our guest today, Jay Baer, his book called Talk Triggers, and more about word-of-mouth marketing, please see our show notes at shapingopinion.com. If you enjoyed this episode, please let people know by leaving a rating and review in Apple Podcasts. You can subscribe to the Shaping Opinion podcast on iTunes or wherever you listen to your podcasts. We'd love to hear from you. On Twitter, just tweet to us at Shaping Opinion, or you can get in touch with us through our website, shapingopinion.com. We have a Facebook group that you can join, a Facebook page you can follow, and we're on Instagram at Shaping Opinion. Shaping Opinion is a production of O'Brien Communications. This is where we talk about people, events, and things that have shaped the way we think. Until next time, I'm Tim O'Brien.